Welcome to Sociology of Sexualities at McMaster University, the online course Sociology 3U03. I'm Dr. Tina Fettner. My name, as I said, is Dr. Tina Fettner. I'm an expert in LGBTQ and anti-LGBTQ social movements. Right, so I've looked at both sides of those opposing movements in both the United States and in Canada. I also have studied social policy around sexuality, attitudes toward lesbian and gay people. And my most current work is looking at how social forces shape sexual behavior. If you need to get a hold of me in this class, I'm working with a teaching assistant, and my email for the class is soc3u03@mcmaster.ca. Okay, that's first is a letter O, and the next one is a 3U03. Please include your name and student number in all your correspondence, and if you let me know this is the online class, then I'll be able to keep track of you. That's great. Thank you. I'll learn about sex as a social phenomenon. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. I'm going to talk about sexual behaviors, sexual identities, sexuality and community. And we're going to look at the way that social values, norms, and attitudes about sexuality make a difference in how people think about sexuality and in how they act. We're also going to look at the intersections between sexuality and other social institutions, and we're going to talk about sexuality and inequality. All right, so this early question is one that is going to be the guiding light for the whole class. What is social about sexuality? This is especially important because mostly we learn about sex as personal and intimate and private, right? That's true. Our sexual identities are personal, our sexual relationships are personal, and the kind of sexual behaviors we do are the product of our personal choices. I don't think any of that is not true, but I think in addition to that, sex is also social. Sociologists like me see sexualities as extending beyond individual choices, right? Here's an example. Your sexual relationship also are related to your kinship ties. Like, think about the institution of marriage, right? Sexuality organizes families, right? Your sexual partner is also likely to be the parent of your children, is also shaping what your family looks like. But sex and sexuality also can organize friendships. If we look at who is friends with each other, we'll see that people with similar sexual identities tend to cluster together in friendship groups. If we look a little farther, we see that sexual identities have produced interesting subcultures with their own cultural norms and values, their own music and films, their own style of speech, and that's also very social rather than personal. So because this is a sociology class, we're going to focus on these more social dimensions of sex and sexuality, and I think it's going to be really enjoyable, and I think that you're going to learn a lot. I want to talk today about the way that social forces affect your sexual behaviors. Right? We already talked about how your sexual behaviors are the product of your personal choices, and that's true. But those personal choices are happening in a social context, and sociologists like to look at the way that social contexts, social forces that are outside of you shape the way that you make your social choices, and in this case, your sexual choices. So we're going to look at rates of gonorrhea transmission over time. Right? This is a chart of the rates per 100,000 population of the number of cases of gonorrhea infections in the United States every year from 1941 to 2017. Right? It's about the longest running tally of sexually transmitted infection that we have. And so it's a great way to see how social forces operating over time shape an entire population, in this case the United States, sexual behavior, in this case, catching a sexually transmitted infection. So I want to direct your attention to a couple parts of this chart, a couple of places where gonorrhea transmission was higher or lower than other times. Right? So the first period right here is the period where the United States was involved in World War II. Right? And in fact, World War II was the inspiration for the United States starting to collect these data in the first place. Right? The U.S. government, and especially the military, started to become worried that their soldiers and sailors were catching gonorrhea and other sexually transmitted infections, and they were worried it was going to become a public health crisis and affect the sort of wartime readiness or the military capacity of the United States fighting this important war. So they started collecting these data and monitoring cases so that they could have a public health response. And they kept recording these cases over time so we could learn from it. So you see how a world war might affect sexual behavior choices because, when young men were drafted, women were working in urban wartime industries. We have a kind of social upheaval that broke people away from their families when they were a sort of young adult age and when many people weren't married. And it gave lots of people opportunities to have premarital sex that weren't available to them before 1941, right? The war sort of created sexual opportunities. And you could see how after the wartime years ended, we have a decline in the rate of gonorrhea transmission. And we see this kind of happy housewife 50s and the early 60s as being a time when people settled down, went back, when social norms about premarital sex became more regularly enforced, and people were more likely to have kind of a single sexual partner that they got married to, and that they only had sex with them over their lifetime. And sort of that kind of behavior on average led to lower rates of gonorrhea infection. Right? But of course, there were still some, right? Those norms aren't determining our choices, but they're influencing our choices. But of course, this little blip in World War II is absolutely nothing compared to this giant increase in gonorrhea transmission in the late 1960s through the 1970s and into the 1980s. Right? This is also a situation where social forces were affecting our sexual behaviors. And in this case, it wasn't a war, but there were two really important social forces that were going on here that I want to call to your attention. Right? The first is the invention and widespread distribution of the birth control pill. Right? So this sort of technological advance in sexuality, for the first time, really could more or less reliably separate out pregnancy risk from having sex. And so this sort of was a technological precursor to some of the cultural changes that were also happening at this time. So you might know that 1969 is known as the Summer of Love. We see this as the era of free love, hippies, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the lesbian and gay movement, anti-war movement were all happening at this time. And there was a really great sort of cultural shift that increased people's embrace of higher numbers of sexual partners, a really big shift in the social norm around premarital sex, right? Attitudes thinking premarital sex was immoral dropped dramatically around the end of the 1960s, and people thought it was no big deal. Okay, so high rates of gonorrhea go along with this increased number of sexual partners and these new social norms and values around sex and sexuality. But what would have caused the rates to go back down after this 2-decade-long period of high rates of gonorrhea? Well, the next period immediately following, in the 1980s, was the AIDS crisis, where HIV was infecting and killing just large numbers of mostly men in the gay community, and of course, people who are sharing needles. And so this devastating disease was sexually transmitted. It had no known cure. We still don't have a cure for it, even though our treatments are vastly improved over this period of the 1980s. But this this called for a serious public health response and a real attention to sex education, right? And so sex education around how to have safer sex that didn't transmit sexually transmitted diseases, and especially condom use, was all of a sudden very important part of our educational curriculum, and also a very important part of our larger sexual cultures, right? So people started using condoms in much higher numbers than before, and this caused the rates of all kinds of sexually transmitted infections to go down, including gonorrhea. And so this was a real win for public health, for the use of accurate sex education curriculums to really have a positive impact on public health. And so it was kind of a moment where we decided to start talking about sex, and we saw that talking about sex in a matter-of-fact way had a positive impact on our public health. So that story lasted from 1996 here all the way through about 2012, 2013, when rates of gonorrhea transmission started to go up again, and condom use is starting to go down. And it seems that young people today don't use condoms as much as those of us who were young adults in the 1980s and 90s did. It's not so much of a big deal anymore. People are not so worried about HIV because they think that the catching the disease doesn't necessarily result in death, and it's causing gonorrhea rates to increase. Now, it's not increased a ton so far, but I think there are several of us, myself included, that are worried that this little blip up might be the start of another gonorrhea mountain. And one of the reasons to worry about that is because the treatments available for gonorrhea are actually on the decline. So this next chart is showing similar sort of gonorrhea over time, but from a different perspective. First of all, notice that the time frame is different. This is looking at from 2000 to 2017. But this shows the percentage of gonorrhea strains of different kinds that's resistant to the antibiotics that treat them, right? So that means this is gonorrhea that is difficult, and some people worry it might become impossible to treat with antibiotics. And of course, there's a great possibility that these kinds of antibiotic resistant strains are going to grow and become more prevalent. And so that's a real public health worry once again. And I'm hoping that we will increase our condom usage before we see another serious public health crisis. Okay, so let's talk about why we just talked about gonorrhea for 5 minutes, right? This, in my mind, is an example of how social forces shape our sexual behavior, right? Things that have maybe nothing to do with sexuality at all, like war, or that have things to do with sex and sexuality that aren't personal and individual, like technological developments in birth control and medication, like sex education curriculum, like cultural shifts. Right? These are all social forces that shape the context in which we as individuals are making our personal choices about sex and sexuality. Right? So this is showing that sexual behavior is also social, in addition to being personal. So over this course of the next several weeks, we're going to have many more examples to look at how sexuality is deeply social and how it extends beyond our personal individual choices. Now we're also going to look at how sexuality is not just shaped by social forces, but in fact I'm going to try to convince you that sexuality is a social force that shapes our social world. That in fact, it is one of the things that organizes the kinds of choices that we have. It shapes the social context in which we act and other dimensions of our lives. But I won't try to convince you of that today. I'll take my time and give you a little bit of evidence here and there throughout the course.